Wait, no. Dang it. Go over there. Okay. Now, you're gonna wait and watch Brendan beat the crap out of me. Enjoy it.
Goodbye, cruel world. What are you talking about? It's my freaking eyeball. You would not want to see what I just saw. To make sure that you don't see, I'm just gonna end it. See you next time on another JTTV.